Hi guys, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. As always, I'm your host Lefarius, and for this week's show we will be taking a look at probably the longest name Amiga game I've ever seen, Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters. Though before we get into that B-movie madness, we need to take a look at this week's Amiga news. Now first up is a YouTube channel I've been following for quite some time now, in particular because they're doing a lot of Amiga art live shows. They've been digging into things like Deluxe Paint Free, Disney Animation Studio, lots of live Amiga pixel art. Now these videos, they are highly detailed and she spends a lot of time walking through all the different elements of the software. It's suitable for beginners right up to, I don't know if you can really call it professional anymore. Do professional Amiga artists exist? I'm not entirely sure. I've not seen it in my Twitter feed, but Pixel Vixen does a hell of a job at it, so it's well worth looking at. Again, these tend to crop up every couple of weeks and they tend to be about 2 or 3 hours long. You can always watch them back on YouTube, I suppose, but there really is something for everybody here, and if you've got any sort of vague interest right up to you really know what you're doing with these sort of programs, it's well worth watching. It has been a bit of a crazy week for YouTube videos. I've spent a hell of a lot of time just watching all these different Amiga ones. Next up was a CD32 expansion card. I'm not sure what to call it, a comparison video. Basically a chap called CRG spends about 20 minutes comparing the TF328, the TF330 and the original hardware. So you basically get 3 shots of the different cards and the original playing things like Gloom. I think Doom's on there. It's not Doom, is it? No, it's Gloom. It's Gloom. What am I going on about? All these different CD32 games, Elite as well, that comes to mind. And really putting it through its paces and showing what each card can do. I've always been of the impression that when I finally get a CD32, I'm definitely going to pick up one of these Terrible Firecards, they're called. But I always thought the TF328 was the go-to one, but from these videos it's really obvious which is the better one, so I highly recommend it. I had a lot of fun watching this. This guy seems to do this sort of thing for the Amiga quite a lot, so follow the link in the show notes and go and check out his channel. Finally, another website I just came across on my random Amiga travels is basically gamescoffer.co.uk. I'm always on the lookout for interesting Amiga downloads, things to mess about with and just to try out on the systems I've got. And I just noticed this by chance as I was looking for different sort of like Amiga disc magazines, that this site had a full page dedicated to them with a download for each of them. Now this is all the stuff going back, well, I suppose it'll be the late 80s and into the 90s. There's piles upon piles of these Amiga disc magazines. There's a full collection there. Everything you could ever possibly think of is on there. I'm sure you might have read some of these yourself in the past, or you might have just been intrigued to see what they're like. And don't forget, I did the interviewing one a couple of months ago, so it's well worth checking out. Even I've not seen this sort of stuff together on a single website like that. Really easy to download. There's no signing up or anything. You just grab what you want, download it, and off you go. Hell, you can even burn it to a floppy disk and run it on the original Amiga if you want. And with that out of the way, let's move over to this week's game. This week's game is a bit of a strange one. It's not really something I ever got a chance to play. It was a type of game I'd never really been interested in, like the isometric, you know, like exploring that 3D type of level. They've never really stood out or appealed to me. I can appreciate why people love them so much, you know, because they're probably quite good games, though I could never really get into them. And I think that comes back from my time on playing on Spectrum and, you know, all them type of games back then. They look good and everything, but I just couldn't get on with the visual style, so anything that I thought was like that I just tended to avoid. And I thought this game was, well, basically one of those, so I definitely kept away from it. And just by chance I was looking through the Amiga library and this one just stood out with, well, what a crazy title it's got. Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters. It doesn't get any better than that. And I thought, well, I'm going to go back to it and give it a go, just see what it's like. And before I knew what was happening, I'd lost about an hour of playtime. I just couldn't believe how well I got sucked in just to give it a go. So yeah, we're definitely going to deep dive into it this week, and I'm quite looking forward to covering this one properly. It was published by Domark, and they did lots of Atari arcade games, I think. Conversions of APB, Cyberball, Grandstand, Heroes, even Pictionary and Pit Fighter as well. I do want to do an episode on that at some point. Also something like Rampart. They did loads and loads of arcade titles, and it was a massive list. Now, it was developed by Teak, who I think we've mentioned before, although I might be wrong. Were they the developers behind Strider? I completely forget now. Anyway, they worked on Brutal Sports, Football, Chase HQ, Clax, Manchester United, Pac-Mania, Tubin, Zybots, etc, etc. Another huge arcade conversionist specialist sort of team. I don't know what to call them. Now, this came out in 1990 and it was just on a single floppy disk. Now, it was a 2-player game and priced at £19.99. The coder behind this was called Barry Costas. He worked on other games like Badlands, I think that's an Atari game, Brutal Football, Revelation, Shadowlands and Shadow Worlds. I wonder if those two are linked. Now, the graphics were done by Neil Adamson. He worked on Botix, Hill Street Blues, Man United Europe and Man United Double. I think that Double game was one I played a lot as a kid. And Rogue Trooper, as well as a few other games, though we won't get into the rest of them. Music wise was done by Matt Furniss, who was responsible for some great tunes on Alien 3, Castle Master, Chase HQ again, Clax. I do want to do a show on that game eventually. It's actually quite good. Hard Driving and Pit Fighter. It's almost like that game is calling out for me to cover it. We shall have to see. Now, this is a straight up arcade port, but Barry Costas, that was the coder, remember, seems to have had a good history with these kind of isometric games. There's not much info on the actual Amiga port, I'm sad to say, but they did remove the blood and gore from all of the home versions, and that's definitely been done on the Amiga one. It does mean though that we can only really have a look at what happened with the original arcade game. Now, this was in development for a good 12 months before Dave Ackers was brought on board. It seems that the development team couldn't really pull all this game together, so they really needed to get some help. They were even using graph paper and typing actual level layouts by hand that they had. It just wasn't working, as it required far too much effort for them to get it all working. So Dave approached Dennis Harper, who had just finished Tubin, that's the game where you're going down the river on the rubber rings, and he asked him to help, and he managed to bring across Tubin's level editor, which they were able to rejig and get it working with the escape game. This did mean that a lot of the previous work was, well, effectively cancelled and ditched, but it was much better doing this with a different engine rather than cancelling the game completely. They then got to work changing all of the code from Escape to work with the Tubin engine, and that meant that they could quickly design all of the levels and the ideas that they had in mind. So it sort of worked out for everybody. When it came to Escape, Atari's previous games like Marble Madness and Paperboy actually provided the inspiration for this, especially with that isometric view. I mean, that always reminded me of the Ultimate Rare games, as I said before, and I've never been a huge fan of them and always tried to avoid them up until now. It's just lucky that I'm covering the Amiga port, because from all the mentions of it online and all the different reviews and things, this is meant to be like the best version of the game available. Atari wasn't even sure if this could even do very well. It's quite a standout and odd game, so they sent a test cabinet out for an arcade to, well, just see the reaction. But players managed to discover a huge bug around one of the escalators, which is what you move around through the different floors, and after apologising profusely and refunding all of the money that people have been losing in this, Dave Ackers actually brought it back into the warehouse and made, well, lots and lots of changes and got it working properly. It seemed to do the trick though, and the reactions from when they posted it back out there were huge and very, very positive. When they finally released it to the general public, it was just as popular and it sold extremely well. I mean, enough so that Domark were interested in doing ports of this to multiple systems. Despite the game's arcade roots, it never really managed anything more than the computer ports, though this could have been a console game quite easily. It's just very, very odd that it never actually happened. Though it is one of Dave Ackers' proudest achievements, and he states in an interview that he set out to make a fun two-player isometric gauntlet-style game with a sort of 50s retro science theme, if that's the right way to put it, and they definitely managed that, as I'm sure you'll see when we get into the review. When I was looking into the history of the game in general, I did find one funny reference where an ST magazine actually released a demo of the game for people to try, but it turned out that this wasn't a demo, but it was actually the full game, and this is like prior to release, so people were going absolutely mad for it and buying this magazine in great numbers. But what a daft thing to do. Just imagine your luck picking up this cheap magazine and then finding this like free £20 game which is brand new on the cover. Now, it was ported to the CPC 464, the Atari STE, obviously, Commodore 64, the Sam Coupe, that's a souped-up Spectrum, I believe, also PC, and a Speccy port. Again, the Speccy there with the isometric games, I don't know what it was about that computer in this type of game, it just seemed to be perfect for them. We need to start off and have a look at the game's main story, of course, as Jake or Duke, members of the interplanetary SWAT team, you must travel to Planet X, a synthetic industrial planetoid, to rescue Professor Cerebellum. Oh my god. And free the enslaved hostages who are being forced to create an evil robot army which is destined to destroy Earth and help the hostages before they are turned into robo-zombies. Your mission is to transport them all back to your ship in time and rid Planet X of the evil Reptilons. And that's all you get. It's not exactly the deepest of stories, though there's probably more to that than some of the other games we've covered on this show. Now, the aim of the game is to move throughout the stages, rescuing as many hostages as possible before activating escalator switches and running up to the next floor before discovering the glass tube transporter, I don't know how else to describe it, which will then take you on to the next level. Now, the main stages take part on this industrialized metallic world with lots of 50s era B-movie futuristic technology, so there's lots of clunky robots, plenty of glass tubes and all manner of tech that you just wouldn't work in the real world, but it fits the look of it all perfectly. Now, the opening level consists of an isometric viewpoint with a full 3D world to explore, with the top 2/3 of the screen showing the main game and the bottom displaying a 2-player bar which is split in red on the left and green on the right. Now, each represents a different player, showing off the score. You've got 3 energy bars in there as well as the number of matching lives, number of bombs you've got, as well as this ray power bar which you can refill with these green fuel cells as you take out all the enemies. At least I think they are fuel cells. It doesn't actually tell you what they are, but you just have to see what you think of them by, well, have a look at the footage that I've done. Now, you play a typical hero in a red jumper suit and he's wearing shades of all things, and the game itself moves at a fairly quick pace with lots of enemies on screen. They're always on your tail and they can flood the gaming area time and time again. Luckily though, you are fast enough to be able to outrun them all, but with them often ganging up on you, you can get in tight spots as the levels are often riddled with obstacles, so you've always got to be on your toes. Now there's lots of robos, traps, booby trap floors, even things like moving spikes mounted on the walls. You're having to keep an eye on everything around you all the time. Now it can be quite easy to get stuck in a spot, unable to escape and having your energy drained away in no time at all. If you do die though, there is a few seconds of invulnerability which we'll definitely need, as the crowds of enemies around you can get to be quite challenging in some very tight spots. Now the main aim of the game is saving hostages, though you don't have to save them if you don't want to. Every time you do, it fills a shuttle at the end of the level, which in turn gives you an extra energy bar, and you will need them by the way, as well as an extra life when you hit 100,000 points, so it's well worth saving as many of them as you can. Now the controls might seem a little strange at first, as you can hold down fire to use your ray gun and turn the joystick to move it around. It's almost like a flamethrower in a way, as the more power you have collected, the stronger the beam that flies out of it does go out a fair old bit. If you run out of power though, you can still send out a brief yet rapid fire shot which can take several hits to take out single enemies. It's not ideal though, you really want to be saving up as much power for that ray gun as possible, so it's often smarter to build up lots of power before you take on a large group of them. Luckily, if things get too much, you can use a bomb to take out a small group, but those are limited in number, and ideally you need to save them for the big boss counters when you finally come before them. Speaking of which, every third level has an evil Reptilon boss, and these are gigantic metal robots, at least compared to the size of the main character. They also move in very different patterns to all of the other enemies and tend to fire a spray of bullets or different types of damage depending on the boss. It can be quite manic, as the bullets tend to follow you around whilst you're dodging around the boss, and all of the bosses can be taken out with a ray gun, but I found it was much better to use the actual bombs, as they do a lot more damage and you don't die as much. They are all pretty tough if you don't have enough bombs, though it's good to have the option. Now after every boss, there's a bonus level feature with you flying this floating car. I think it's like a hover car in a way, and that's down these metal passageways, or I don't know, are they canals? I'm not entirely sure. Now this is a very simple isometric maze where you're dotting the car around. You've only got about 30 seconds to go, and you either have to learn the right route on each of these bonus stages, or just guess as it moves around at a fair old pace, and you can easily pick up some speed if you end up flying the car forward too quick. Now if you hit the wrong road though, it's just a dead end and you have to drive back and choose another path. One or two of these mistakes is usually okay to make, but after that you just won't make it through. If you manage it though, you do get to choose which path to take for the next stage, so it's well worth the effort as each one is different. It means there's around 30 stages to see on different playthroughs. You can see how heavily it's all based on the B movies of the 1950s, and it reminded me of films like Forbidden Planet and that styling of War of the Worlds. There's so much colour on show and everything is so well drawn that I honestly could have been fooled into thinking I was playing this at an arcade. It's not perfect by any means, but it's as close as you're going to get for the Amiga, and they've done a great job with all of the robo enemies. There's also a lot of them as well, with every stage being littered to the rafter with all sorts of different types. I've not even mentioned the animation effects, which are funny and great to boot. There's lots of different ways to die in this with the animations to match. So like for example, if you fall over cliff edges, which always made me chuckle as you cling on for dear life, or you can be struck through with spikes and all other manner of of deaths, and to be honest, you're going to want to see all of these for yourself, so I'm not spoiling too many. Now, there's only a single song for the entire game, with a few sound effects for weapons, fire and collecting things, so it's not going to be seen as an audio masterpiece. It certainly gets the job done, and it feels passable for a tune in this sort of a game. As a game, it does have its issues. First of all, it's not always easy to line up the ray gun shots due to the isometric view, as enemies can be on completely different lines or levels to where you're aiming at a distance. Even though it all moves so quickly, it doesn't really matter a lot of the time, as you just tend to run and gun. But if you take a moment to concentrate and try and fire properly, it can be a bit off-putting. Especially when they're shooting at you from an angle, it's annoying to not be lined up right. Maybe if they'd added a bit wider line to the weapon spray, it would have been a tiny bit better. Now, the game itself can be quite tough, and it does feel like an arcade game, having to pump in lots of cash. I guess that makes it a great arcade conversion of the sort. Sadly, it does have a bit of a slowdown issue, especially when it gets really frantic and there's lots and lots of enemies filling the screen, though it's not enough to break the game or cause too many major problems. Though again, not surprising considering how many enemies are constantly on top of you and flooded around, and you've got all these explosions going on at once, and it really is chaotic, but it's an awesome lot of chaos that you have to deal with constantly on the fly. Now, it can become a bit samey, as the level designs are the same throughout the entire game, but the bosses and car sections do break it up quite nicely, and they are different enough that it makes you feel like it's all part of a proper industrial world. Also, the music from when the game loads never stops, and it's on a constant loop. There is an option to turn it off, but most of the time it didn't annoy me, so I just ended up leaving it on. It's one of those things that will either annoy you or you won't mind it at all, entirely down to you. Now, the magazine scores for this were a bit of a mixed bag. CU Amiga gave it 86%, Amiga Power 83%, Amiga Format 82%, it's lower in bit by bit, and Amiga Action at 78%. That's not bad for this sort of a game really, that's a 7 to a 9 effectively. In order to prepare for this week's show, I had to go and give this a whirl on MAME first, as it's something I've never played before. I've avoided it for years because I tend not to enjoy these isometric puzzlers, you know, things like head over heels, and I've always thought this was one of them. It wasn't until I actually started messing around with a few games and decided to fire this up that I was really surprised how different it was to what I expected. And it's great. It's fast, it's frantic, and I had a great time exploring each of the stages. I do wish they'd done a lot more with the graphics, or even added some hidden bonuses. You know, the arcade didn't have this, but it is a port, so I guess it's only to be expected. Now, I did like the little bits of humour and the 50s tech. They were a great mix together, and I really enjoyed blasting my way through all the levels. It felt like an isometric version of Contra, minus the leaping about, and it just kept me wanting more. Though I am a bit split about the level designs, because I love how there's so many to choose from on the different paths. Having to beat a maze and then choose the right way to go opens up an awful lot of possibilities, but all the levels tend to have the same look, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I guess in the long run there's not much in the way of variety, so probably not going to keep you going through very long periods. I will say though that games like this are why I love doing this show. This is something I completely missed out on as a kid because of my dislike of its look and my own stupidity, but having to dig a lot deeper into the library of games, it's opening up stuff I would never have touched before. The bonus with this is I've found something I'm going to keep on playing, as it's a very quick, fun arcade blast that's worth sticking to. And I think it's one of those ideal games when you've just got a few minutes spare, just want to have a quick blast, you can jump right in, enjoy yourself, and then just ditch it after. You know, the world's not going to end, but it's a great arcade port. It's about time to wrap up the show. If you have any comments about anything I've said today, or you just want to drop me some sort of a question, pop along to AMIGArama.com. Drop me an email, which is lefarius@AMIGArama.com, or come along to the Facebook page on facebook.com/AMIGArama, or follow the show on Twitter @AMIGAramaPod. Now, as always, we need to send out a huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. The list is ever growing bigger, and if you'd like to get involved and get next week's show a whole week early, you can pop along to patreon.com/AMIGArama. And our active Patreons are Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Premski, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. And not forgetting our newest Patreon, 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast. Until next time, guys.